June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy had become death traps. These ancient earthen walls, topped with dense vegetation and centuries-old roots, formed natural fortresses that turned every field into a killing zone. For Curtis Culin, a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey, the sound of another Sherman tank exploding had become sickeningly routine. Culin wasn't an engineer. He had no college degree, no formal training in mechanics or design. He fixed things, that's what he did. Back home, he worked with his hands, solved problems as they came. But here, in the blood-soaked bocage of France, the problems were measured in lives lost, not broken machinery. The Sherman tanks, America's armored pride, were being slaughtered. Every time they attempted to climb over a hedgerow, the tank would tilt upward, exposing its vulnerable underbelly to German gunners hidden on the other side. The soft armor underneath couldn't withstand even basic anti-tank weapons. It was like sending soldiers into battle with their chests bare. Culin had watched it happen again that morning. A tank from his battalion had approached a hedgerow, revved its engine, and begun its climb. For a moment, it seemed it might make it. Then came the flash, a Panzerfaust striking the exposed belly. The explosion was brief, but the screams lasted longer. 3 men died inside that steel coffin before anyone could reach them. He sat alone that evening, a piece of paper spread before him on an ammunition crate. His hands were stained with grease and dirt, trembling slightly as he sketched. The other soldiers thought he was writing a letter home. Instead, he was drawing crude diagrams, angles, measurements, ideas that seemed almost too simple to work. What if they didn't need to climb over the hedgerows? What if they could cut through them instead? The idea felt simultaneously obvious and impossible, welding steel prongs to the front of a Sherman, like enormous teeth that could tear through earth and roots. It was the kind of solution a mechanic would dream up, not a trained engineer. And that's what terrified him. Who was he to propose this? A sergeant from New Jersey who barely finished high school, suggesting modifications to the U.S. Army's main battle tank. The absurdity of it made him want to crumple the paper and forget the whole thing. But then he remembered the screams. Culin looked at the drawings again. The logic was sound, even if crude. Czech hedgehogs, those steel anti-tank barriers the Germans had scattered across the beaches, could be cut up and welded onto the Sherman's front. The weight wouldn't be excessive. The angle would allow the tank to drive straight through the hedgerow rather than over it, keeping the vulnerable underside protected. It could work. It should work. The question was whether anyone would listen to him. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow he would present his idea to his commanding officer. Tomorrow he would either save lives or confirm what he'd always suspected about himself, that he was just a mechanic playing at being something more. Outside, another tank engine roared in the distance, followed by the sound he'd learned to dread. Silence, then shouting, then the inevitable explosion. Culin closed his eyes and made his decision. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but the weight of doing nothing was worse. The command tent smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and desperation. Curtis Culin stood at attention, his sketches clutched in hands that refused to stay still. Across from him, Captain James Morrison studied the crude drawings with an expression that cycled between confusion and skepticism. "Let me understand this correctly, Sergeant." Morrison set the paper down, rubbing his temples. "You want to weld scrap metal to the front of our tanks. Czech hedgehogs, sir. The steel barriers from the beach obstacles." Cullin's voice was steadier than he felt. "We cut them into prongs, attach them to the Sherman's hull. The tank drives straight through the hedgerow instead of climbing over it." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "And you came up with this how exactly? What's your background in engineering?" There it was, the question Culin had been dreading. "None, sir. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. You fix things." Morrison repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. "Sergeant, we have actual engineers who've been trying to solve this problem for weeks, men with degrees from MIT, from West Point, and you think the solution is to stick some twisted metal on a tank?" Culin felt his face flush, but he pressed forward. "Sir, with respect, those engineers aren't watching men burn alive every day. The physics is simple. If we don't climb over the hedgerow, we don't expose the belly. The prongs cut through the earth and roots like a plow. The tank stays level. The armor stays protected. Simple. Morrison lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke toward the tent's canvas ceiling. If it's so simple, why hasn't anyone thought of it before? Maybe they thought it was too simple, sir. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Cullen's mind raced with doubts. What if he was wrong? What if the weight threw off the tank's balance? What if the prongs buckled under pressure? What if this entire plan was the foolish dream of an uneducated mechanic who didn't know enough to realize how little he knew? But then Morrison leaned forward, studying the sketches again with different eyes. How many men would you need? Culin blinked. Sir, to build this thing. How many men? How much time? A welding team, maybe 6 soldiers. Access to the beach obstacles. 2 days, perhaps 3. Morrison crushed his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. You get 2 days, Sergeant. 2 days to build your contraption and prove it works. If it fails, you're back to regular duty and we never speak of this again. If it succeeds, he paused, looking at Culin with something that might have been respect. If it succeeds, you might just save this entire operation. Culin saluted, his heart pounding. Thank you, sir. As he turned to leave, Morrison called out, Sergeant, those men who died this morning, I knew them. One had a daughter he'd never met. So understand this. If your invention fails, more men die. But if you don't try, they die anyway. Either way, the blood is on all our hands. Outside the tent, Culin steadied himself against a supply truck. The weight of Morrison's words pressed down on him like physical force. He thought about the daughter who would never know her father, about the crews still trapped in burning tanks, about the thin line between salvation and disaster. He had 48 hours to prove that a simple mechanic could change the course of war. The work began at dawn. Curtis Culin assembled his team, 6 soldiers who knew their way around welding torches and metal, near a battered Sherman tank that had been pulled from the line for repairs. Around them lay scattered pieces of Czech hedgehogs, jagged steel teeth that had once been designed to stop Allied tanks on the beaches. Now, they would become their salvation. Cut them into sections, about 3 feet long, Culin demonstrated with a hacksaw, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who'd spent his life working with metal. We need 6 prongs total, angled forward at 45 degrees. Private Davis, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh, squinted at the design. Sarge, you sure this won't throw off the tank's weight distribution? It'll add maybe 500 pounds to the front. The Sherman can handle it. Culin hoped his voice carried more certainty than he felt. For 2 days, they worked without stopping. The acetylene torches burned blue-white in the Norman sunlight. Sparks cascaded like miniature fireworks as metal met metal. Culin barely slept, constantly adjusting angles, reinforcing welds, double-checking measurements against his crude sketches. Every decision felt monumental. Too much weight and the tank would nosedive into the ground. Too little, and the prongs would crumple against the hedgerow's dense roots. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, it was finished. 6 steel prongs jutted from the Sherman's front hull, like the tusks of some mechanical beast. The welds were rough but solid. The tank looked absurd, almost comical, a hybrid between American engineering and improvised desperation. Captain Morrison arrived with a small crowd of officers. Some looked curious, others openly dismissive. One colonel actually laughed. Well, Sergeant, let's see if your contraption works or if we've just wasted 2 days. The test hedgerow stood 50 yards away, an ancient earthen wall, 8 feet high, topped with gnarled roots and dense bramble. Beyond it, German positions still held strong. This wasn't just a test. It was a preview of countless battles to come. Culin climbed into the commander's hatch, his heart hammered against his ribs as the engine roared to life. The Sherman lurched forward, gathering speed. 30 yards, 20, 10. The prongs hit the hedgerow with a sound like thunder. Earth exploded outward, roots snapped and tore. The tank didn't climb. It plowed through, staying level, protected, unstoppable. In 15 seconds, they were on the other side. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Men who'd been skeptical minutes before now crowded around the Sherman, examining the prongs, touching the torn earth as if it were miraculous. Morrison was actually smiling, but Culin felt no elation. Standing beside the conquered hedgerow, watching the enthusiasm spread through the ranks, a different thought took root in his mind. This invention would work too well, perhaps. Tanks that could move freely through the bocage would accelerate the Allied advance dramatically. Commanders would push harder, faster, deeper into enemy territory. More speed meant more aggression. More aggression meant more risk. More risk meant more casualties, just distributed differently. He'd solved one problem only to create another he couldn't yet name. "Congratulations, Sergeant." Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll start mass production immediately. Every Sherman in Normandy will have these by week's end." Culin nodded, managing a smile he didn't feel. Around him, soldiers celebrated a breakthrough that would change the war. But in his mind, he was already calculating costs he couldn't yet measure. Within a week, 300 Sherman tanks had been fitted with Cullin's hedgerow cutters. Within 2 weeks, that number had tripled. The invention spread through the Allied armored divisions like wildfire, transforming the static nightmare of the bocage into fluid, aggressive warfare. Towns that had resisted for days fell in hours. German defensive lines, carefully constructed around the assumption that hedgerows were impassable, collapsed. The Allied advance accelerated at a pace no one had anticipated. Curtis Culin should have felt triumphant. Instead, he sat in a logistics meeting that had been called specifically because of his invention's success, watching senior officers argue over maps covered in colored pins and increasingly frantic notations. "We're moving too fast." Lieutenant Colonel Patterson jabbed his finger at a cluster of pins representing armored divisions. "The supply lines can't keep up. We're outrunning our own fuel trucks. The tanks are consuming ammunition at triple the projected rate," added Major Hendricks, a logistics officer whose exhaustion showed in the dark circles under his eyes. "We planned for methodical advances, not this kind of breakthrough. We're running convoys 24 hours a day and still falling behind." Captain Morrison looked across the table at Culin. "Sergeant, your invention worked exactly as promised. Perhaps too well. We didn't account for what happens when suddenly every tank commander wants to push forward simultaneously." The irony wasn't lost on Culin. He'd created a solution to save lives by preventing tanks from being destroyed on the hedgerows. Now, those same tanks were racing ahead so quickly that they were running out of fuel in forward positions, becoming stationary targets anyway. The supply chain, designed for a slow grinding campaign, was buckling under the pressure of rapid success. "We're also seeing maintenance issues," Morrison continued. "The hedgerow cutters are durable, but the constant use is wearing down transmissions, track assemblies, engine mounts. Parts that should last months are failing in weeks." Patterson pulled out a damage report. "Yesterday, 12 tanks in the 4th Armored were immobilized, not by enemy fire, but by mechanical failure. They'd pushed 70 miles in 3 days. The maintenance crews can't keep pace." Culin felt a knot tightening in his chest. He'd never considered this angle. In his mind, the invention was binary. It either worked or didn't. But warfare wasn't binary. Every advantage created new vulnerabilities, new pressures on systems that were already stretched thin. And there's another issue. Hendricks spread out casualty reports. "When tanks can move freely, commanders order them to move. We're seeing increased engagement rates, more contact with enemy forces, more aggressive tactics. The hedgerow cutter eliminated one type of vulnerability, but encouraged behaviors that create others." The words hit Culin like physical blows. He'd built something to save soldiers, but the strategic response to his invention was pushing those same soldiers into more frequent, more intense combat. The calculus of war had shifted, and not entirely in the direction he'd intended. "Sergeant Culin," Patterson's voice cut through his thoughts, "we need your practical expertise. You solved the hedgerow problem. Can you help us solve the logistics problem your solution created?" Culin looked at the maps, the reports, the faces of officers grappling with success they hadn't prepared for. He was a mechanic, not a strategist. He fixed things that were broken, not systems that were working too well. But he'd started this chain reaction, and somehow that made it his responsibility to help manage the consequences. "I'll try, sir," he said quietly, though he had no idea where to begin. 3 weeks after the first hedgerow cutter tore through Norman earth, The Allied advance had penetrated 40 miles deeper into France than any pre-invasion plan had anticipated. Curtis Culin stood at a forward observation post, watching Sherman tanks, each equipped with his invention, roll past in an endless metallic procession toward the front lines. They moved with a confidence that hadn't existed before. Commanders no longer hesitated at hedgerows. They simply pointed their tanks forward and drove through. The psychological shift was as significant as the tactical one. Fear had been replaced by momentum, caution by aggression. But momentum had a cost that couldn't be measured in fuel or replacement parts. Culin had visited a field hospital that morning. The wounded told stories of advances so rapid that infantry couldn't keep up with the tanks, leaving armor exposed to German anti-tank teams. They described commanders ordering attacks that would have been considered reckless 3 weeks ago, but were now standard procedure. The hedgerow cutter had removed one obstacle, so leadership simply found new objectives beyond it. "It's like we're racing," one lieutenant had said, his leg wrapped in bloody bandages. "Racing to finish the war before anyone stops to think about what we're doing." Private Davis found Culin at the observation post, carrying 2 cups of terrible coffee. The welder who'd helped build the first prototype looked older than he had 3 weeks ago. They all did. "Sarge, you hear about Baker Company?" Culin shook his head. "Pushed 10 miles yesterday. Overran a German supply depot. Captured 50 prisoners, then ran out of fuel 5 miles behind enemy lines. Had to hold position for 8 hours until supply trucks caught up. Lost 4 tanks and 16 men in the counterattack." The coffee tasted like ash in Cullin's mouth. Because they moved too fast. Because they could move too fast. Davis stared at the passing tanks. "Your invention let them do it, so they did it. Nobody asked if they should." That was the truth Culin had been avoiding. His invention hadn't just solved a tactical problem, it had fundamentally altered how commanders thought about armored warfare in the bocage. The hedgerow cutter had become permission to be aggressive, to take risks that seemed justified by the technical advantage it provided. "You think I made a mistake?" Culin asked quietly. Davis considered the question. "I think you saved a lot of tankers from being sitting ducks. But I also think war finds ways to kill people no matter what advantages you give them. You changed how they die, maybe, not whether they die." Below them, another column of Shermans passed, their hedgerow cutters gleaming in the afternoon sun. Each one represented lives saved from the specific horror of being trapped in a tank climbing a hedgerow. But each one also represented new risks, new pressures, new ways for young men to find themselves in impossible situations. Culin had created his invention to save lives. He was beginning to understand that in war, salvation and destruction were often the same thing, just viewed from different angles. The advance continued, the killing continued, and his simple mechanical solution had become something far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. September 1944. The war in France was nearing its end. Curtis Culin sat in a tent, surrounded by officers adorned with medals he couldn't name. Outside, a banner read, "Innovation saves lives." He couldn't shake the irony. The invention he'd created in desperation had changed the war, but it had never felt like a victory to him. General Bradley had come to present the Legion of Merit. The words sounded hollow to Culin. For exceptional merit and outstanding service, he had welded metal together. It wasn't heroism, it was just something that needed doing. As Bradley spoke of how Cullin's invention had revolutionized the battlefield, the applause felt like a distant echo. He heard the words, but they didn't reach him. Later, Captain Morrison, now promoted to Major, found Culin alone. "You don't look like a man who just received a Legion of Merit," Morrison remarked, offering a cigarette. Culin exhaled slowly, his mind drifting. "How many men have died since we started using the cutters, sir?" Morrison stiffened. "That's not a fair question, Sergeant." "Isn't it? We accelerated the advance. We pushed deeper, too fast. Supply lines broke down. Maintenance couldn't keep up. The infantry couldn't keep pace. I built something to save tankers from burning in their tanks, but the war found other ways to kill them." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "You saved lives, Curtis. The numbers speak for themselves. 43 tanks lost in the first week without the cutter. 7 in the month after. That's real. Those are lives. And how many lives have we lost because of what followed?" Culin countered. Because commanders thought they could push harder, faster. I don't have an answer for that, Morrison said softly, but that's not on you. Culin looked down at the medal in his hand, the weight of it unfamiliar. I didn't solve the war, sir. I just stopped one kind of death, but the rest, it just keeps coming. Morrison shook his head. History won't remember it that way. Then history's wrong, Culin said quietly, the weight of the moment sinking in. December 1944. The war had moved on. Curtis Culin sat in a small depot in Belgium, watching fresh soldiers arrive from the States. They were younger than he remembered being, but only months had passed since he'd first landed in Normandy. The hedgerow cutter had become standard. Every Sherman that rolled off the line was now equipped with the prongs he'd designed. It wasn't his invention anymore. It belonged to the war machine, mass-produced and institutionalized. A young lieutenant approached, recognizing Cullin's medal. "You're the one who invented the cutter, right?" he asked, his voice full of admiration. Culin nodded, his expression unreadable. "That invention saved my brother's life. He was in the 4th Armored. Said they'd have been slaughtered without it. Thank you." Culin watched him leave, the gratitude still hanging in the air. He was grateful too. But the weight of it all, how his invention had helped save lives, but also pushed others into harm's way, sat heavily on his chest. He thought about how the Germans had built the Czech hedgehogs to stop tanks. The Americans had turned those same obstacles into tools for advancing. Defense had become offense, and that shift was never as simple as it seemed. Private Davis approached, holding 2 cups of bad coffee. "Heard they're writing you up for the papers back home. The mechanic who won the war," something like that. Culin grimaced. "I didn't win anything. I welded some metal together." Davis sat beside him. "That metal changed everything, Sarge." "Did it?" Culin stared at the passing tanks, their prongs gleaming in the fading light. "Or did it just change how fast we got to where we were always going?" Davis was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "You saved a lot of lives, Sarge. You gave tankers a chance." "That's enough." Culin wanted to believe him. He wanted to accept that simple narrative. But war wasn't simple. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about the choices that led to the outcome, the consequences that rippled outward, affecting everyone. The sun set over the battlefield, and the tanks continued their advance, carrying with them the weight of Culin's invention. He had created something that saved lives, but it had also changed the rules of war in ways no one could predict. May 1945. The war was over. Curtis Culin returned to New Jersey, where life seemed impossibly distant from the hedgerows of Normandy. The newspapers had called him a hero, and the army had given him medals. But to Culin, it felt like nothing more than a chapter in a much larger story. He went back to fixing things, cars, engines, the simple problems of everyday life. It was cleaner, simpler. A problem fixed meant it was done. There were no moral calculations, no unintended consequences, but sometimes, late at night, he thought about the hedgerow cutter, about the lives it saved, and the complications it created, about how a simple solution had become something far larger, far more complicated than he'd ever intended. War had driven innovation before, new ways to kill, new ways to survive, and in the end, it was all just a tool, amplifying human capacity for both salvation and destruction. Curtis Culin had solved a problem. He had saved lives. That would have to be enough.